There is an assumption so deeply embedded in the way we think about warfare that most people never question it. The assumption is this: that the most dangerous weapons are the most complicated ones, that lethality scales with engineering, that the weapon requiring the most resources, the most expertise, the most industrial infrastructure to produce is, by definition, the weapon most to be feared. The Second World War spent 6 years systematically disproving that assumption. The weapons that changed the course of individual engagements, that cleared bunkers, stopped tank columns, broke infantry advances, and killed men who believed themselves protected by distance and armor and doctrine, were not always the weapons that came from the largest factories or required the most specialized training to operate. Some of the most lethal instruments of that war looked, to the untrained eye, like nothing at all. A glass bottle, a wire stretched across a road, a piece of pipe, a sharpened stake buried in soft earth. The simplicity was not accidental. It was, in many cases, precisely the source of the danger. A complicated weapon can be identified, categorized, defended against. The soldier who knows what he is facing can prepare for it. But a weapon that looks like debris, like accident, like the random detritus of a broken landscape, that weapon works on the mind before it works on the body. It turns the entire environment into a threat. It makes the act of moving forward, of simply walking from one point to another, into a calculation of survival that never fully resolves. What follows are 10 weapons that the history books tend to pass over quickly because they do not photograph well and do not fit the narrative of industrial age warfare. They were simple, they were cheap, and in the right hands, in the right terrain, they were among the most lethal things the war produced. Number 10. The Molotov cocktail. Every army in the Second World War operated under a foundational assumption about anti-armor combat. Stopping a tank required a dedicated anti-tank weapon, an artillery piece, a purpose-designed rocket launcher, a shaped charge munition engineered to penetrate hardened steel. This assumption existed because it was largely correct. Tanks were built to withstand small arms fire, and the gap between what a rifle could do and what a tank could withstand was vast enough to seem unbridgeable by improvisation. The Finns decided otherwise. The Molotov cocktail, a bottle of flammable liquid fitted with a burning wick, had existed as a concept long before the Winter War of 1939. But it was Finnish soldiers, outnumbered and outgunned against Soviet armored columns pushing through terrain that tanks were not designed to navigate, who elevated it from a crude improvisation into a genuine tactical weapon. They did not throw it at the armor itself. They threw it at the engine vents, at the vision blocks, at the joints where the turret met the hull, the places where heat and flame could enter a vehicle designed to stop bullets, but not fire. The result was not always the dramatic explosion of popular imagination. Sometimes it was slower. The crew inside a burning tank had seconds to choose: stay inside an increasingly unsurvivable space, or open the hatches and emerge into the guns of the men who had set the tank on fire. Either choice was fatal. The Soviet army, staggered by its losses in Finland, formally studied the Molotov cocktail and incorporated it into its own doctrine. Other armies followed. The weapon that required a glass bottle and a rag became standard issue in armies that had entered the war with carefully engineered anti-tank systems. The doctrine said, stop tanks with anti-tank weapons. The bottle said, stop tanks with fire. In the forests of Finland, the bottle was right. Number 9. Barbed wire. Barbed wire is not a weapon in the conventional sense. It does not fire. It does not explode. It does not move. It is a passive obstacle, a means of controlling terrain, a tool of agricultural fencing repurposed for military use so gradually and so thoroughly that by the Second World War it had become so ubiquitous as to be nearly invisible in historical accounts of the fighting. That invisibility is the point. Barbed wire did not kill directly, in most cases. What it did was stop movement. It held an advancing soldier in place, in the open, in the killing ground between positions, for the seconds or minutes that other weapons needed to do their work. A machine gun nest without wire in front of it is a fixed weapon that an attacker can approach under cover, find angles on, suppress, and eventually overrun. A machine gun nest with wire in front of it is a killing machine that can work at leisure against men who are stuck, tangled, trying to free themselves with hands that are occupied with wire instead of with weapons. German defensive doctrine in the Second World War placed barbed wire at the center of its positional defense. Belts of wire, interlocking, sometimes electrified, often booby-trapped with grenades or trip flares, designed not to stop an attack, but to slow it to the pace at which the other defensive weapons could engage it. Allied soldiers training for the Normandy landings spent weeks practicing wire crossing under fire, a skill that should not have been necessary, in theory, given the technological sophistication of the invasion force, but that was absolutely necessary in practice because the wire was still there, doing in 1944 what it had done in 1916. The simplest obstacle, the hardest to solve. And behind every line of wire, something was waiting that had been given time by the wire to take careful aim. Number 8. The S-mine. The German S-mine, the shrapnel mine, called the Bouncing Betty by Allied soldiers, was not, in principle, a complicated device. A steel canister, buried flush with the ground, triggered by pressure or by a tripwire. When triggered, a propellant charge launched the canister approximately 1 meter into the air before the main charge detonated, sending steel balls in every direction at the height of a standing man's torso. The genius of the S-mine was not its mechanism. It was its psychology. A mine that explodes at ground level can be partially protected against by lying flat. A mine that launches itself to waist height before exploding cannot be protected against by any instinctive response. The soldier who sees it trip has approximately half a second to make a decision about which direction to run, knowing that any direction exposes some part of his body to the fragmentation pattern. The correct answer, standing perfectly still, runs counter to every survival instinct that combat has trained into him. Over 1.93 million S-mines were produced. Allied soldiers advancing through defended territory had to cross ground where any step might trigger one, where the wire or the terrain channeled movement through lanes that had been mined, where the only way forward was through a space where the ground itself was armed and waiting. The psychological toll of this, the mandatory slowness, the acute awareness of every footfall, the understanding that the earth underfoot might be the last thing a man stood on, was a form of weapon that operated continuously, even in sectors where no mine had yet been triggered. The mine did not need to detonate to do its work. The possibility of detonation was sufficient. Number 7. The punji stick. The Second World War, in its Pacific and Asian theaters, introduced Western military forces to a category of weapon that their entire doctrinal framework was unprepared to address. Not because the weapon was technologically sophisticated, because it was not sophisticated at all. The punji stick, a sharpened bamboo stake, hardened by fire, sometimes treated with materials designed to promote infection, concealed in a pit covered with light vegetation, was used by guerrilla forces in the jungles of Southeast Asia against Japanese and Allied forces alike. It required no manufacturing infrastructure, no supply chain, no specialized knowledge. It required a sharp stick and a hole in the ground. Against soldiers moving through dense jungle, where visibility was measured in meters and the ground was perpetually obscured by vegetation, it was devastatingly effective. Not primarily because of the wound it caused, a puncture wound, painful and potentially infectious, but survivable in most cases with adequate medical care, but because of what it demanded of every soldier who knew it was being used in the area. Every step had to be tested. Every patch of ground had to be assessed before weight was committed to it. Movement that would have taken an hour in clear terrain took 3 hours through jungle, where the ground itself was suspect, and the medical burden, soldiers wounded by punji sticks who could not be easily evacuated, who required treatment that consumed resources and personnel, accumulated in ways that battlefield casualty figures did not fully capture. The armies of the industrialized world, with their artillery and their air support and their logistics systems, were slowed and bled by sharpened sticks in the ground. The gap between technological sophistication and tactical effectiveness had rarely been demonstrated so starkly. Number 6. The teller mine. If you've made it this far, you have seen weapons that worked through psychology as much as physics, that killed indirectly as much as directly, that derived their lethality not from engineering complexity, but from the simplicity of the problem they solved. What follows is where that simplicity begins to interface with the most powerful weapons the war produced, and the consequences of that interface become harder to look at directly. The teller mine was a German anti-tank mine, a flat steel disc, roughly the size of a dinner plate, containing several kilograms of TNT designed to detonate under the weight of a vehicle. It was not complicated. The triggering mechanism was a pressure plate. The casing was stamped steel. The explosive was standard. A reasonably skilled worker could assemble one in minutes. What it could do to an armored vehicle was not simple at all. A tank column moving through contested territory needed to clear mines before it could advance. Clearing mines meant sending engineers ahead of the armor, on foot, in ground that was also covered by enemy fire, probing the surface with rods to find and mark what was buried. This process was slow, dangerous, and, because German defensive doctrine placed teller mines in patterns that also included anti-personnel mines to kill the engineers who came to clear the anti-tank mines, designed to generate casualties at every stage of the removal process, the mine within the mine, the trap within the obstacle, the layered system of simple devices that created a defensive architecture that no single sophisticated weapon could fully address. German engineers laying teller mine fields in the weeks before major Allied offensives were not employing high technology. They were burying plates of steel and explosive in the dark, marking the locations in their own maps, and trusting that the simplicity of the device would survive whatever the Allied engineers brought to find it. In many cases, that trust was justified. Number 5. The satchel charge. The expectation of every army entering the Second World War was that fortified positions, concrete bunkers, reinforced pillboxes, hardened command posts, would be engaged by dedicated weapons, artillery, air attack, purpose-designed anti-fortification munitions. The logic was sound. Concrete is not vulnerable to small arms fire. It requires a significant explosive effect delivered with precision to achieve a breach. What it does not require is a complicated delivery mechanism. The satchel charge, a canvas bag filled with blocks of explosive, fitted with a time delay fuse, was one of the most straightforward weapons of the war. Any explosive that could be packed into a bag and carried by a single soldier could be placed against a hardened structure and detonated with results that no amount of small arms fire could replicate. The engineering was not in the charge itself. It was in the act of getting close enough to place it. At Palaiu, at Iwo Jima, at the bunker complexes of the Siegfried Line, the moment of decision repeatedly came down to a single soldier crossing open ground under fire with a bag of explosive in his hand, reaching the structure that the artillery and the air support had not been able to finish, and placing the charge against the wall before the wound or the bullet that was coming for him arrived. The weapon was simple. The act was not survivable in any predictable way, and yet men did it, repeatedly, in engagement after engagement, because the alternative was a position that could not be taken any other way, and positions that could not be taken meant men who did not come home. What would you choose? The open ground, the bag in your hand, and the calculation that you might reach the wall, or the knowledge that without you, the position holds? Number 4. The wire garrote. There are entries on this list that can be discussed in the language of tactics, of doctrine, of military utility. The wire garrote is not one of them. It sits in a different category, not because it was more or less lethal than the other weapons here, but because of what it required from the man who used it. The garrote, a length of wire or cord used to strangle silently, was standard equipment for Allied and Axis commando and special operations units throughout the war. It appeared in the training manuals of the British Special Operations Executive, the American Office of Strategic Services, and the German Brandenburger commando units. It was issued, it was taught, it was used. It required its user to be close enough to his target to touch him, to exert sustained physical force, to remain present for the duration of the act, which took longer than any firearm and required deliberate continuation of effort that a trigger pull did not. Military institutions that trained soldiers in its use did so because silent killing at close range was a genuine operational requirement for clandestine operations, the sentry who could not be allowed to raise an alarm, the guard whose rifle shot would compromise a mission. The requirement was real. The solution was this. What military training could not fully address was what the act cost the man who performed it. The psychological literature on close-quarters killing, on the difference between killing at range and killing in contact, is substantial, and it consistently identifies proximity as the primary variable in the severity of the psychological aftermath. The garrote is as proximate as killing gets. The weapon was simple. The weight it placed on the man who carried it was not. Number 3. The hand grenade. The hand grenade is so familiar an image of the Second World War that it has ceased for most people to carry any particular weight of meaning. It appears in every film, in every museum exhibit, in every illustration of infantry combat from 1939 to 1945. It is the default weapon of the default war. Its presence is assumed. Its function is understood. There is nothing surprising left about it. This familiarity is the reason it belongs near the top of this list. The hand grenade was the most widely used close-quarters weapon of the war. Its effective range was the distance a man could throw, approximately 30 to 40 meters for a trained soldier, less under stress, less in confined spaces, less when wounded or exhausted or fighting uphill. Within that range, it was nearly impossible to defend against. It could clear a room without the thrower entering it. It could be rolled around corners, dropped through windows, thrown over walls. It did not require aim in the way a rifle required aim. It required only that it land close enough. The failure modes were intimate and immediate. A grenade returned by the enemy, thrown back before the fuse burned down, was not a theoretical risk. It was a documented, recurring event in every theater of the war. The soldier who threw a grenade and miscalculated the fuse timing, or who threw it into a space where the throw was deflected, was in danger from his own weapon. The grenade that cooked off in the hand, detonating before it was thrown, because the fuse had been damaged or was shorter than stamped, was a category of casualty that appeared in medical reports of every army that used it. The grenade asked a question of every soldier who pulled the pin. Are you certain enough of your throw to stake your life on it? In the noise and chaos and physical deterioration of close-quarters combat, certainty of that kind was not always available. And yet the pin was pulled, again and again, in room after room, in trench after trench, in the dark and the fire and the confusion, because the alternative to throwing was to allow the position to remain held by men who would also throw. Number 2. The sniper's position. The sniper himself is not the weapon. The rifle is the weapon, addressed elsewhere in the histories of this war, catalogued and studied and understood. What belongs on this list is something that has no serial number and appears on no requisition form, the position from which the sniper operates. Every army in the Second World War trained snipers. Every army understood the tactical value of a single soldier capable of engaging targets at extreme range with precision. The doctrine was clear. The training was extensive. The rifles were carefully selected and maintained. What the doctrine did not fully capture was what a single well-positioned sniper did to an entire formation's behavior, not through the men he shot, but through the men who knew he was there and could not find him. A sniper's position is a weapon of paralysis. An infantry advance that takes fire from a sniper halts. The soldiers go to ground. Movement becomes hazardous. Every raised head is a calculation. The medic who goes to help a wounded man must decide whether the sniper who shot him is still watching that spot, waiting for exactly that response. The officer who needs to observe the ground ahead to make his next decision must choose between observation and concealment. The act of command, of moving, of communicating, of maintaining situational awareness becomes a series of mortal gambles. The position was often nothing. A pile of rubble, a collapsed building, a tree. The preparation required was a good eye, patience, and the discipline to remain perfectly still for hours, while everything around was noise and movement and urgency. Against this, armies brought artillery, air support, counter-sniper teams, and the accumulated technology of industrial warfare. Sometimes it worked quickly. Sometimes the position held for days, bleeding the advance one shot at a time, each shot less about the casualty it caused than about the time it bought and the caution it forced on everyone in range of where it might have come from. The simplest position, the most asymmetric return on investment the war produced measured in blood and time. Number 1, a single bullet. There is no weapon simpler than a single round of ammunition, a metal casing, a propellant charge, a projectile. The engineering that produced it is not trivial. Ballistics, metallurgy, chemistry all contribute, but the object itself, held in a hand, weighs almost nothing. It can be carried by the hundreds. It can be fired from a weapon so old it predates the war by decades. It is the most basic unit of ranged killing in the history of human conflict. And the single bullet, not a barrage, not a bombardment, not a strategic campaign, changed the course of the Second World War more decisively than almost any other category of weapon. The bullet that kills a platoon commander at the moment of decision, the bullet that wounds an officer badly enough that he is evacuated, and the unit he would have led into a specific position instead waits, uncertain, for orders that come too late. The bullet that kills the engineer who knows where the mines are, or the radio man whose equipment connects a unit to the support it needs, or the tank commander who has his hatch open because the visibility inside the vehicle is not sufficient for the terrain ahead. These are not hypothetical cases. They are documented in after-action reports, in the testimony of survivors, in the unit histories of engagements where a single casualty at a single moment altered the decision tree of an entire operation. The Second World War was, at the strategic level, a conflict of industrial scale, of armies and air forces and logistics chains of unimaginable complexity. But it was also, at its irreducible core, a conflict of individual moments. And in those moments, the bullet was the instrument, the simplest weapon, the most personal, the one that required nothing beyond a finger's pressure and a moment of alignment between a human eye and a human target. Every system of warfare, no matter how complex, no matter how technological, no matter how sophisticated the platforms and the munitions and the doctrine, every system eventually reduces to this: a person, a weapon, a decision made in a fraction of a second that cannot be unmade. The Second World War teaches many lessons, and historians have spent 8 decades cataloging them. But the lesson that the simplest weapons on this list teach, the bottle, the wire, the stick in the ground, the round in the chamber, is the one that the architects of sophisticated warfare most consistently resist. Complexity does not protect against simplicity. It only makes simplicity harder to anticipate. And in the space between anticipation and arrival, the simple weapon has always found its moment.